Okay. We're live now, and welcome everybody to Simply Sada, our webinar series. This is episode 20, I believe, but this is my first time hosting it. So for me, this is episode one. We have a great guest with us today, joining us all the way from Berlin. I will let him introduce himself in a bit, but let me introduce myself. My name's Ali, and I'm senior product manager at SadaPay. Before joining SadaPay, I was with Kareem with the product team there, and yeah, I think I've been with SadaPay for a few months now, and hoping to stay for a while until we deliver a great product. And with me, I have Rizwan Rafique, who's senior product manager at Wayfair. And Rizwan, over to you now. Please tell the audience about yourself a little bit and a bit about your career journey and how you got into product management.
Sure. Thanks, Ali. Thanks for inviting me over to this webinar. I'm super excited to talk about one of the topics that we're both very passionate about. So as Ali said, my name is Rizwan. I'm currently based out of Berlin. I work at Wayfair, which is an e-commerce company specifically focused on the home and living side of the market. I've been working professionally for about 9 years. The first 5 years of the first 4 years of my life into a very business savvy role in Pakistan, and then the remaining 5 years or so in product management in Europe. So I started my career with Daraz, as most of you would know. It's an e-commerce company. Initially, it was backed by Rocket Internet, but now acquired by Alibaba. I spent about 4 years there running their logistics business. So if you know Daraz, they have customers who buy the product, they have suppliers who essentially fulfill the product, and they have a logistics business which works with either their own fleet or their third party to deliver the goods to the customers. So my 4 years there, we essentially built the whole fleet that you see now. Back in the days, the volume was lower. Now it's exponentially higher. And most of my time I was working on the ground, managing inbound that comes into our warehouse, as well as what is being shipped and getting delivered to our customers. So a lot of time spent with the users on the ground. That led to my interest in product management, where I was coordinating a lot with our team in Berlin and Portugal to build products, which led my move to Portugal, where I joined Jumia, which is a sister company of Daraz. And that's where the product management career started. My time there was about 3 years, and I spent that time building their last mile allocation engine, as well as a lot of products that work on the supplier facing side. So my experience throughout this time is very B2B instead of B2C. So most of the talk that we'll have will focus around that narrative. And now at Wayfair, I'm here for about almost 2 years now. And right now I also work on the supplier facing products, predominantly focus on simplifying inventory management for a marketplace seller at Wayfair. And during this time, essentially most of the users that I work with over the last 5 years are either focused on Pakistan or Southeast Asia, Africa, or European market, or as well as the North American markets. It's a diverse portfolio, but there is a lot that we have in common versus the differences that you guys may think we have. So yeah, that's my journey.
Well, excellent, Rizwan. I think one of the things that I picked up on was your product management habit of setting the right expectations. So you've clarified right from the start that you have a lot of B2B experience. But of course, I think for the purpose of this conversation, a lot of the principles that apply to B2B, B2C, and especially in your case, I think it's a lot of B2B2C, right? So a lot of those principles will still apply to everybody. And I think that's a great starting point for us. I think our listeners can see that the topic of our conversation is centered around product market fit. The second part around the 9 billion will come to that also, but let's start with product market fit, right? So in your words, how would you describe and how would you explain product market fit in the simplest terms to our listeners right now?
So product market fit, I think the name says it itself, but essentially you build a solution that solves a market need. And the solution could be a product or could just be a WhatsApp group to communicate, right? So the term product is quite vague here. The number of solutions that you could frame as a product could vary. So my definition here is if there is a solution in the market that you have put up that solves an actual market need, then you have a product market fit. Otherwise, you just have an idea and trying to scale without really a need for it.
Yeah, great. I think great. That's a great starting point for us. I think you spoke a lot about two things there. You spoke a lot about market need, and of course, we know that the market is comprised of customers. Now, those customers can be businesses, or they can be end customers out there. And in your introduction, you also spoke about how you transitioned from a commercial business role to a product management role. So let's start by talking about how important is it to know your customers, and what can product managers, entrepreneurs, CEOs, everybody out there trying to solve a problem, what can they do to be closer to their to their target market?
Okay, I'll break it down into two points. I think we can talk about why is it important to know your users, and then maybe what are the pathways that you could use to understand your users better. I think what my learnings are from my time here is you could build a fantastic solution, top-notch engineering, top-notch design, and you could show it to a user, and that the user may use it because you have convinced them to onboard, but they will not come back because you have not solved a need that they would like. I'll give an example of that. We worked on a solution back in Jumia to simplify routing for our drivers. And what that meant is I use a GPS on my phone, and essentially the route is built, right? But we found out that the riders stop for lunch. The riders would stop for different breaks. They may have different stops that we are not aware of, right? And they will not follow the map as it said. You can force it, but it's just not efficient because they may know routes that you do not know about, right? So we are not solving for a need. We saw a problem, we built a solution, but that solution essentially did not work. So if you do not know your users, if you do not know the motivations of your users, there is a pretty high chance that you will end up building something that no one essentially needs. Now, coming to the second part of the question, maybe one more point here. I think my career in product management has only been great because I got that time for the first 4 years at Daraz, working very close with the drivers that we were operating with, the challenges with the 3PLs that we had, the warehousing staff, which was doing cycle counts, picking and packing. And it's essentially each time our volume would increase, we would increase the number of people working on operations at the same level. And that is clearly
Yeah,
not scalable,
that's
right?
very Pakistani way of solving problems, right? You throw more people at it.
Exactly. I mean, there's a very interesting saying from a friend where it say, okay, if I have more orders, I will just put more janta to solve it. So I think that covers the need to talk to your users a lot more. The second part of it is how do you get it? Right. So there are multiple strategies to follow. I think the classic, and it always works, is you go one-to-one, see a user, talk to them about potential problems that they have. If you have a prototype, show it to them and get their feedback on it. But in most cases, and I mean, I work at Wayfair where we have ample of users, but it also is very hard for us to reach out to the users. So in some cases, we also use proxies. So people who are not necessarily users, but they can advocate on behalf of the user because they work so closely with it. In some companies, that could be your customer service or business development people who work very closely with the clients, and they can translate that need. The challenge with that is they will tell you the solution that they need and not necessarily the problem. and that problem would always come from the user. So it's a very delicate path that you have to follow. You should only go to a proxy if absolutely there is no way to reach the user in time. And the third approach that we actually at Wayfair follow a lot, because our user base is so diverse. The partners that we work with are very differ very quite a lot in terms of the scale that they operate in. I'll give you an example. There is a supplier in the US who has 25 warehouses. And we also have suppliers who probably are working from their garage or a very small store, right? So if you have such a big scale at which you operate it is very important to find the target user that you want to work on. And especially at Wayfair, we rely a lot on service, because there is already a product in place, and any new innovation, there is already traction. There is already people who are coming to that product on a daily basis. So we use a lot of in-product messaging or surveys to collect that feedback from them.
Okay, I have a very interesting question about it. I think as product managers, we experience it every day, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I think a lot of organizations kind of don't have a structured process for gathering this feedback from customers, right? So everybody understands that you have to listen to the customer, but a lot of times this customer feedback is basically anecdotes that somebody comes up with. So everybody has Slack now, everybody has Microsoft Teams. You have a feedback channel, and somebody says, my grandma was using the app and she said it's very hard to look at XYZ. And then this becomes the next focus for the app. So my question to you is, how do you know which anecdotes to focus on and which anecdotes to use to form hypothesis? And once you form the hypothesis, what should you do with it?
Okay. Very interesting question, and very relatable as well. It happens all the time here. There's a very interesting quote from Netscape's founder, I think it was, and he said, "Let's look at data. If we have data, if we only have opinions, let's go with mine." Right. So I think the answer to that is always to look at the data. I think one-off cases do not show a pattern. So either you have a pattern that can be proved by data. Anecdotes, I think, are very important to set context. So if, let's say, for example, your retention is going down, some anecdotes would explain why that retention is going down. So it could help you go a bit deeper into, okay, there could be 3 categories in which could be the reasons to go down. Let's go with, let's essentially deep dive on one of them, right? So it helps with creating empathy. It helps with getting close to your user. But I would slide, if there are 2 options, only on stories and data, I would slide on the data front a lot more and use the story to essentially build context for people who do not have enough context. The second part of the question that you asked is, how do you remove that noise that always comes up, right? I know at Jumia we did an experiment where each NPS response would come into a Slack message and it shows up. And the intention was very good. It's like, yeah, we need to know what our users are saying. But what it ended up doing is, at each retrospective that we would have with the team or each discussion, people would bring up that NPS, and that NPS, although it's a one-off comment, would take up most of the discussion, right, and defending. So what we ended up doing is we ended up consolidating a lot of the responses and essentially tying that, as I said, to the data. So remove that noise, day-to-day noise, put a filter in who can triage that response and not essentially put all the raw feedback to the team, because I think they're focused on doing much more important things than triaging, I would say.
Nice. I think that's a very good answer, Rizwan. While we're on the subject of customers and unmet needs, I think one of our listeners is very passionate about the question. He sent it twice already. I don't want him to send it more times, so I'll read it out to you. He says, "Are enterprise customers and their requirements a bigger uphill task in product development as opposed to B2C? So is it harder to find requirements for B2B users than it is for B2C?"
I think the finding the requirements actually is easier. Deciding if you want to build all those requirements is the harder part. So for example, if Wayfair has X thousand suppliers, or Jumia had so let's take Jumia as an example because it's much more diverse in terms of the people that work on it. So Jumia worked in 12 countries, 12 African countries, right? And the user needs could be varying largely. So a lot of the work that we did is, okay, we would have a pool of requests and we would find things that we could build in an abstract format and things which are very localized. And in this case could be your enterprise customer could say, okay, I want this specific feature that fits only their need, versus there could be an underlying problem that exists in all the different clients that you have, uh,
Mhm.
solve for it. So if the question is only on requirements finding, you have a sales agent who's working with a B2B client. If you go for 1 hour, they will tell you what are the problems with your product. Trust me, it's an easier task that way. I think deciding whether you want to focus on that need, and that could depend on a lot of your ROI analysis. Is the feature too big to implement? What is the impact that you could? Generally, in terms of tenants, I would say you look at, is this a problem for your user? How big the problem is? What essentially metrics does it help with on the company side? And then decide whether you really want to pursue that opportunity or not.
Great. I think that's really, that was actually going to be my next question to you, and I think we can build on your answer here. So, like you said, right? It's easy to find requirements. There will be, and it's the same with B2C as well, right? If you have your ear to the ground, you will listen to a lot of things that people are saying. Okay, I need this, I need that. And the next question really is, how do you decide what to build? How do you decide what value you want to offer? You touched on a few things there about the size of the problem, about the feasibility. So just sum it up for us. How do you decide the value that you want to offer to your customers, be it B2B or B2C?
Sure. So I think I'll give an example of Wayfair, because over there it's a lot more structured than the previous companies I essentially worked with. So the general tenants are like, in terms of strategies on what to prioritize, you have a couple of them. You could do an ROI analysis. As I said, you have a problem space and it could lead to X amount of revenue or customers or whatever essentially you're chasing. And then you have a cost of it. That essentially is very it's a good method to do this when you're iterating a lot. So if you're building a linear product, in cases where you do not have any customer yet, and if you're working on innovation, I would focus on prioritizing for learning instead of prioritizing for a customer or a revenue, because in some cases that's just essentially to learn what essentially is the need of the market, compared to solving the actual need, right? So at Wayfair, we have a framework where we use OKRs to prioritize. So there are company OKRs that we need to follow, and that translates into each of the verticals that we work with. So that helps with prioritization. So I'll give you an example. One of our tenants is to have building global products, right? Um, what that means is, if from a prioritization perspective, if there is a need that comes up for only a small segment of the market, we don't focus on it. It's easier that way. You can kill the noise, because the company has decided that the bigger opportunity here is global and not local, right? The same way, essentially, one of our prioritization tenets is, we don't build things that do not scale. So the idea is that if your revenue increases by 20%, your headcount should not increase by 20% accordingly. And to be honest, that may and may not be the secret sauce to find product market fit. And I'll build on that. For example, Wayfair's product today, if you look at it, at least the B2B product, it looks like an ERP, very poor user interface, but it does the job. And that just doing the job has got them to, say, the 9 billion annual revenue number, right? I think that the prioritization tenets have to be very carefully thought of, and that should come from your strategy or the goal that you're trying to achieve. Different paths here could be, you can use the ROI method, the simplest but the hardest to calculate, because you will never know, you can never anticipate, especially in the early times of the product, how many customers you will gain or how much revenue you will have. And then you can use the other methods, which are either you can put it as a must have, should have, nice to have, and won't have. So that helps you essentially prioritize what is the real need that you're trying to solve, and then only focus on that and keep the should haves or nice to haves for later.
Okay, that's a great answer. But I'm going to throw a couple of terms at you, and let's hear what you think about them, and we can take the discussion forward from there. So the
Sure.
two terms that I have for you are A, MVP, so minimum viable product, and B, MLP, so minimum lovable product. So how do you think about these terms, and do they ever come up in your day to day work?
It's a global debate on these two terms. My view, I think, because we work in the B2B space, our focus predominantly is on MVP, but the love element is always there for it. But the idea is to build something so basic that can help you essentially identify if the direction you are heading towards is the right or not, right? And then we can go into amazing UX or building the functionalities that the users are asking for after. So B2B wise, it's a lot MVP, at least for us. The MLP, I think, is a more B2C concept. And actually, from what I've read, MLP is a very hardware focused concept as well. For example, like Sada Pay, if you have actually a card that you need to use, the design of it is something that you really need to put in a lot of thought of, and how the customer is going to transact multiple journeys for it. You really need to think through that before launching the product, because the cost of that iteration could be larger than the time you initially invest to launch. So my I think the opinion could vary a lot based on the use cases that you have. But yeah, I think if you have the resources and have the intellectual capital, then you should always strive for the MLP. Otherwise, I think in most of the cases, if you're just testing the hypothesis, go with the basic version. Do not wait on, do not over-engineer it or over-design it, and launch it to get feedback.
Great, great, great. And I think we will take a few more questions about design. I think that's one thing that I do want to talk about. But before we get into that, I think so. We spoke about how companies can start from the ground up, listen to the customers, find out about their unmet needs, then come up with value that they want to offer, then decide on a prioritization approach. Now the company is building some stuff, right? But how do they then measure if they're on the right track? So if I decided that I want to build a product that's transparent and that's easy to use, right, and I built a few features to deliver on that value proposition, but how can I make sure that I'm on the right track? So if my features are actually delivering what they were designed to deliver, how do we do?
So a great question, especially, and this question is even more relevant depending on the stage of the company, right? So, for example, if you have a new product, in most of the cases, you're only looking for traction, right? So that would be your North Star. And if that traction is not moving it up, then you essentially do not focus on that functionality at all. If the goal is very clear. I'll give two examples here. So at Jumia, one of the products that I was working on was essentially to build a last mile allocation engine. What that would do is an order would come, and that engine needs to decide who is going to fulfill that item, which supplier is going to fulfill it, and then which last mile provider is going to deliver that order to the customer, right? And the use case was very simple, very easy. The company had some goals, operational goals that we want to meet, and that could only be met because by either reducing that decision making on who should deliver the package, right? The we spent a lot of time in thinking through what the success metrics for that would be, and we ended up deciding essentially the logistics cost per order shipped was our metric. So if and essentially a subsequent metric for that would be lead time. So you should not be only giving the packages to the person who can ship in the cheapest form, but also they need to ensure that the delivery is happening within the SLA. So you could have multiple metrics, but that metric is the reason if you are not looking at qualitative feedback actively, data is what is going to guide your decision on what to do next, right? And it's the same at Wayfair, and I would recommend doing the same for a startup or a new product. I think the caveat here is in some cases you do not have the luxury or the infrastructure to have that tracking in place, right? And that's where you need to decide. I think tools like Google Analytics provide you the basic tracking that are relevant for an early stage startup. But as your product is scaling, I would recommend using Hotjar, which essentially helps you with what the user is doing on the product. And then some North Star metrics that you could define for usability, for the actual execution of the task, as well as maybe link it to revenue if that is your North Star.
Great. And I think you mentioned a bit about usability and design also, right? So let's start the question about design and UX in the context of B2B. What does good design mean in the sense of B2B? And then we'll also talk about stuff that you like as a consumer and what inspires you. But let's start with good design in the context of B2B.
Okay. I'll give an anecdote here. We are doing a user research basically, and so we asked the supplier what can we do to improve their well-being or make the processes more efficient. And one of the narrative or one of the stories that they told us is last Christmas they couldn't go home to have dinner with their family because they were too busy doing inventory management, or the process of inventory management is so poor that it takes them multiple hours and they miss their Christmas dinner. So it's a very clear pain that the supplier is telling you. They also, in a way, also provided you the solution to it, that the product is too complex right now to fulfill. Now, when we deep dived into it, there was a design element that they were counting on, but predominantly the functionality itself was great. So if you click on this button, the button will do what it is supposed to do. So in B2B, predominantly just launching the product, I think we tend towards launching fast, but only if there's a very clear hypothesis, there's a very clear problem statement, and we do it iteratively. So over there, the love for design is, I won't say minimum, but it is just at par. So we are not going above and beyond. As you scale, the design becomes the only way you can scale. So if you have a ton of users and your product is so complex, you will end up hiring so many people whose just responsibility is to explain the product to the client, right? And that is where you can very easily distinguish, okay, this is a very poorly done design versus this design has been really thought through. So I think for us, we put design as at par. So there are standards of design that we over the years have accumulated. So it has to at least be at that par. Going above and beyond is only done once the initial hypothesis is proven. So yeah, I don't know if it answers the question that you asked, but that's the methodology we are following.
Okay. And I mean, the next question is, of course, about B2C design.
Mhm.
Uh, do you have any interesting stories for us? If not, you can just talk about your favorite apps, and we'd love to see, what you like.
Um, I think the part of B2C that I really enjoy is how lightweight should a task be on the app, right? I think if you, especially if you look at apps built by China, in some cases of their e-commerce, it is so engaging. It keeps the attention that you have. So in some sense, I think Southeast Asian products in general are pretty good. One app I actually have been using quite frequently is called Stash Away. It's a wealth management product in Singapore. It has one of the most intuitive design experiences I've seen. There is another one on the payment side that I'm a big fan of is called Cred. It's an app in India. They also do, it's a lifestyle business, but their design actually is known globally as one of the most intuitive products. And I'll give you an example. They did a on the App Store. They released something which was just solving bugs, and the way they have put the notes on solving that bug is it's a very well talked about experience where they said one of our engineers. So they basically put a farewell message of a bug, and how they essentially got into the product and who found it and sorted it out. So that's essentially a very design driven product. And I think if you want to benchmark it, I think Cred and Stashaway would be my recommendation.
Do you have any Pakistani favorite?
I'm a pretty big user of Baikia and Kareem when I'm in Pakistan. So I think Kareem with the Super app actually is doing a pretty good job on design. And Baikia, I know the founder very well, and I know um, uh, the vision of how he wants to see design. I don't know if the product is at that stage yet, but I'm pretty hopeful that that product is going to evolve quite actively.
I think this brings up a question that I've been wanting to ask. I mean, I like discussing it whenever I can, and I'll put this to you as well. I think with in our team, we often discuss, how Baikia is building an app primarily in Urdu, and how no other app in Pakistan is actually doing that. So in terms of localization, and in terms of reaching out to an audience in their own language, what are your thoughts on that, in terms of design and bringing value to the customers, but in their own native language?
I think so there is a piece of so there is a need absolutely to do that if you want to grow locally. So if you are building a product that is B2C and your market right now is not just the elite of that country who speaks English fluently, then you absolutely need to focus on localization. The There is a caveat to that. I think the people who are building the product also read well in English. So it also becomes a challenge because you will probably build the app in English and then translate it into Urdu, right? And that's not how design should be thought of, right? So because you're probably solving the need for an English speaker, and they're just saying, okay, if it scales, then we also have Urdu to translate. I think Baikia is a pretty good example. They have their driver app, which is predominantly in Urdu, because they have a very clear mission. They only build it in Urdu. So it's not there is an English version which is translated. On the customer facing app, that's the case for them. So yeah, I think they've done a pretty good job understanding their user base, and they know that the drivers who will be delivering or taking people around are feel comfortable if it's in Urdu. And I also, like, I was seeing one of the apps, and it says when you start, it says Bismillah, because it's very localized. It doesn't say start; it just says Bismillah, and that's essentially designed, thought through for a local market. So I think what the takeaway here is, if you are building a product where you have pitched your investors or your team that your total addressable market is all of Pakistan, then you have to go Urdu and then English. But if your addressable market is only the 10% Pakistanis who are elite, then I think English is the way to go.
Right, right. So I think that's I think all we wanted to talk about in terms of the listed questions. But you want to go ahead and give a summary to our users of what is good product market fit, just a summary of everything that they can use.
I follow Sam Altman from Y Combinator a lot, and he essentially has a very good definition of product market fit. He says that if you get 100 people who absolutely love your product versus 1,000 people who only like it, the product which has 100 people who love their product has a product market fit, but 1,000 people who just like the product do not. So I would zero in on that. It's a very clear, very outcome focused definition. Find 100 people who are just talking about your product day in, day out. If that is the case, then you have a product market fit. And if I think solving the business, it will come by default. If there are people who love your product, that means that you have found a niche and a need that people need solve for.
Excellent, excellent, great answer. I think our listeners should really hone in on what Rizwan just said, and I think that is the secret to 9 billion. If in case any of you were wondering, great. I think we can go to listener questions now, and I think the first question that we have is design related. So let's start with that. So this is from Basit, this is probably the Basit on my team. So he's a he's a Sada Pe guy, and he says, how much of attractive design solves the user problem and hides the product flaws? So how can good design paper over some cracks and actually go towards solving user problems?
Most of the engineering challenges, I mean, I'll give you my team's example. We have the product is so diverse, and there are so many dependencies that you may not be able to reach what you're trying to by simply just working within your team. You have to coordinate a lot with the dependencies. And recently, and I know it's an old problem, but since I work in the inventory management space, there is a lot of data that we have to work on, right? And which in some cases also leads to, if the supplier has 1 million products to sell, in some cases the product would load infinitely to show those products. The page would load infinitely, right? So we can say, we need to do an engineering overhaul and architecture overhaul. But the other way to just make it fun is if you put a loading sign or a gimmick that gives a perception. So the loading time is also a perception problem. So if you are doing nothing and the page is just loading, it will feel longer. It's very similar to how probably me and Jane were just waiting for this to go live. The last 2 minutes felt longer than the 10-minute conversation that we had before, right? So if you make it fun for the user to wait, yes, great design can essentially hide most of the engineering flaws of the product.
All right, I think that's a great answer, and love your story about papering over the cracks. I think we on our side we've done a bit of that also. I think the question that I have on the screen now, we've already taken that earlier. So while I think our team puts up the next question, I'll ask you another difficult question. We spoke about the apps that you like the most, right? And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to name an app that you absolutely hate.
Mm.
I'll start with mine. And it's in the e-commerce space. So I think maybe you'll relate to it. I absolutely hate shopping on Amazon because I can never figure out their filters. So it's a great app. It has a lot of lot of things available, but I can never find the right thing. So I really don't like shopping on Amazon. But yeah, over to you.
I think there's a note on Amazon. The so the filters and all of it is a content problem, right? So if you have rich content, you can solve for it. I don't know if you know, but 40% I think on the purchases on Amazon is just done based on search. So they double down on search instead of the content. I think content is something that they're trying to solve, but they have decided that Amazon is not a place for discovery. It is a place where people only come if they intend to purchase something. So people have a very clear idea that I want this. They will go to search, they will see top three results and then buy it, right? So yeah, although and the thing is their interface does not change at all. I don't know what their storefront team or front end team does, but they do not change the experience at all. But yeah, maybe one. I think a lot of the German products built only for the German market have a. I shouldn't say this, but they are very poorly designed. There is, and I'm moving houses, so I'm doing a lot of comparison of Wayfair to other players who are very Germany focused, and I'm maybe there is a bias, but I think the other first companies who are working on home furnishing, they really need to step up. They're very poorly designed apps, and not the user experience is not thought through. I think they are focusing on the internal, making the supply chain better, and the product that creates the demand is not thought through.
Yeah, I think this is a challenge in product management, right? It's always easier for the company to solve its own problems before it solves the customer's problems. So if we're Sada Pay, it's easier for us to solve for Sada Pay, right? So we'll do things in this way because it's easier for our finance department or for our product department to do things this way. And it's always harder to solve problems for the user. So I think one of the ways you do achieve product market fit is always making sure that you focus on your end user and the problem that you're solving for that user. And I
That's
think
right.
that is a great segue into the question that we have for us. And Rayan basically says, how would you prioritize between user experience improvements and the effort that it would go into these improvements? Because I think this is a real day-to-day problem that we face as product managers, right? When we're prioritizing stuff, it's always difficult to bring these user experience kind of things up because it obviously sometimes takes a lot more effort. So how what is your philosophy on prioritizing these things?
Um, uh, Within our team or the teams that I work with, and it happens all the time where user experience is deprioritized because it's just too difficult to implement. And in most of the cases, the value that you capture by doing these small user experience improvements um, um, are not clear. I'll give you an example. So if you look at Google, right, there is another search engine which focuses. The name is DuckDuckGo. It's a search engine built for very focused on privacy, right? I like everyone, I think came up with this realization that my data is being used a lot, and I should do something about it. So I switched to DuckDuckGo. Um, the DuckDuckGo experience, it's a very good MVP, but as you said, probably it's not at a lovable state at all. And the user experience improvements that Google has done over time makes it so addictive that after probably 2 months of time, I essentially moved back to Google. So the search results or the quality of search results are the same, but the experience essentially was the reason that I had to go back to Google to essentially do the search related elements, right? So I think if you set a long term goal or at least a 6-month goal, it is that would make more sense when prioritizing versus if you make, okay, this feature is going to lead to 1% increase in conversion rate. It is usually harder to do that because there is no tangible data to see. So unless you have a very glaring problem, the checkout button does not work or the checkout button is not understandable to people, small minor improvements on user experience is very hard to prioritize. So I would recommend putting a 6-month target. Is like we want to increase engagement or NPS on the checkout by X%, and then these are the set of improvements that we need to do, and then prioritize and find time in the roadmap to do that.
Cool. And I think I will now ask you one last question, and then we can end after this one. And this is kind of related to what we just spoke about, right? Is um, is focused on companies that are still in the startup phase, that are still starting out. For example, challenger banks like Startup
Mhm.
Bank, Startup is also kind of in that stage. Companies that are just starting out but are competing with already established companies that have a full feature set. So how do you then, in this situation, would you change anything about your prioritization formula? How would you go about achieving product market fit in that kind of situation?
I think it will go back to the basics. What is the user problem that you're trying to solve? So the first question should be, what is the user problem that people have with the bank, right? And I would go from that. The challenge that you have is the user journey that a person has with the bank. Because the feature set is so rich, they have covered most of the edge cases as well. So for a happy flow, I think it's easier to build. The exception flow is what essentially goes tricky. Um, we at Wayfair we have the same problems, and I think it's a big balance. So you are okay to invest in increasing the headcount to solve for that exception. And I know we have had this conversation about Kareem, where we were talking about Uber has a staff of probably 20 people, and Kareem, on the other hand, has a staff of 300 to do customer service. And it's purely because you are solving for that customer experience exception state through headcount, right? Over time, you will invest into things that improve that and essentially allow the user to do that. Fortunately, with the Pakistani market, we love calling, right? So even though it is a text message or email that says that we will solve your problem, we will still call to follow up. So yeah, I think feature set can be solved by two ways. Either, as you said, we put in more people to solve for that exception state, and then your product essentially only solves the happy flow. And the other scenario here would be you find a niche, very small niche, and essentially iterate from that niche.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, right? Because you can basically just start by making this number of people happy, and then you go from there, and you basically it's bigger circle each time that you iterate. And I think that's a great way to end this. This is all from us. Thank you to everybody who joined in. And Rizwan, you can find both Rizwan and myself on LinkedIn if you have any relevant questions. And yeah, thank you for tuning in, and see you next time, probably with another host. But it's been great, guys. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all. Really enjoyed talking about this topic. It's a topic that me and Jane both are very passionate about. And if you want to hear more, you can always reach out on LinkedIn to talk.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.